Welcome to The Point. I'm Marcia Kramer. Let's get the point of view from the head of social services in New York City, Stephen Banks. This week, Banks and Mayor de Blasio rolled out a bold plan to get the homeless off the streets in 5 years. This as other cities line up to sue New York over the relocation of homeless families outside the Big Apple. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us today. And, I'd like to really start with the homeless plan, which we've described as bold, but the question is, can you do it? 1,000 new apartments, 1,000 new safe haven beds.
So thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the plan that we announced this week and where we are in our overall plans to address homelessness in New York City. As you know, because you've covered this issue since the beginning, and you and I were there at the beginning, it's about a 40-year problem. And I think what New York is doing differently now is taking a comprehensive approach. So addressing street homelessness is one part of our four-part plan.
But that's the thing that people see.
I completely understand that, and that's why we said we've been implementing a program over the last 3 years, you covered it, called Homestat. And we have the results in just 3 years of bringing more than 2,450 people off the streets or remained off the streets. That's 2,250 human beings who are no longer on our streets. And we've done that by increasing the amount of outreach, increasing the number of safe haven beds. And so we think we've found something that's finally actually working to end this 40-year problem.
But you yourself have said, though, that even if you have beds, it has to be the right beds in the right location, and that may prove to be difficult.
So let's focus on what are the core aspects of the program. One is adding 1,000 new safe haven beds. We already have 350 of them identified. And we're going to be able to move forward expeditiously with those. We had a number of offers this week from the faith leaders of additional beds, and I have confidence that we're going to be able to deliver on safe haven beds. Why do I have that confidence? When we were starting the 90-day review that we talked about together about 3 years ago, we only had about 600 beds. We've tripled that number to 1,800 already, and that's how I know we can get to the 1,000. In addition, it's not just the safe haven beds, it's having permanent housing to be able to move people to.
But also permanent housing that have low barriers so people don't have jobs, they don't have to have all these things to get in, they can just go right to housing?
Exactly. And we have a body of work that tells us we can succeed there as well. And that's what we were able to do with chronic veterans homelessness, where we got certified by HUD for ending chronic veterans homelessness. We did things like on West 95th Street, we took an old SRO, we turned it into low barrier housing for veterans, and we can use the same approach to be able to identify these kinds of units that are all around the city. They're out of sight, but not out of mind. We want to be able to use resources that are in the city to help finally solve this problem that's gone on for many years.
But Commissioner, there are people who think that you're dreaming the impossible dream, to quote a song. They look at the mayor's record on other homeless and housing issues. For example, in September 2015, the mayor said he would create 500 safe haven beds at religious institutions, including some at the Archdiocese of New York, one of your partners now. Mm-hmm. So far, just 72 beds have been created. He unveiled a plan several years ago to create 90 new shelters over 5 years. Halfway through, there are about 30. He has a plan to create 15,000 units of supportive housing over 15 years. Through September, 4 years in, 1,300 people had been located. So there's been bold ideas, but there's been a failure to actually come through.
Marcia, we've known each other a long time. I don't think the facts are quite as you presented them, so give me an opportunity to go through them.
Sure, absolutely.
That's why you had me on.
Yes.
So there are 4 elements to the plan that we announced about 2.5 years ago. So we're just shy of 3 years into a 5-year plan. And there are 4 pillars of this plan. The first pillar is prevent homelessness wherever possible. And we've done that by investing in legal services and paying rent arrears. Evictions are up all across the country. They're down by about 1/3 in New York City. That's delivering on an important pillar of this plan. Second pillar of the plan was to rehouse as many people as possible, get them out of shelter, avoid having people come into shelter through the provision of permanent housing. 133,000 men, women, and children are in permanent housing today because of these initiatives. Number 3 in the approach to homelessness had 2 parts. Get out of 360 substandard shelters, the clusters, commercial hotels, which have been used since the 1960s, and site 90 new shelters on a borough basis to give people an opportunity to be housed closer to the anchors of their lives: schools, work, healthcare, houses of worship, family and friends. In less than 3 years, we're out of more than 200 of those 360 locations, and we've cited 60 of the 90 shelters, 30 already up and running. I'm confident that we'll get to the 90. The fourth pillar, addressing street homelessness. And you were there at the beginning when we announced Homestead. There were a lot of skeptics whether Homestead would work. And now we see 3 years later, since April 2016, 2,450 plus lives have been changed by being brought off the street and remaining. Based upon this body of work, we've been able to keep the shelter census flat for the first time in a decade, 2 years in a row.
At about 60,000, which is about 10,000 more than when the mayor took office.
Well, but let's go look at the facts. In 1994, there were about 24,000 people in shelter in the first month of the Giuliani administration. First month of the Bloomberg administration, there were about 31,000 people in shelter. First month of the Blasio administration, 51,000 people in shelter. But in those 3 years, between 2011 and 2014, the shelter system increased by 14,000 people because of the end of the Advantage Rental Assistance Program. We had to break that trajectory. The OMB model, based upon analyzing the trends that this administration inherited, shows that we would have been more than 71,000 people in shelter today if we hadn't made the investments that we made. And as you covered, and I appreciate you did, it was at the midpoint in the first term that the mayor asked me to do a review of homeless services.
That's true.
We developed a series of new recommendations about how to move forward. Central to that was joining the Human Resources Administration with the Department of Homeless Services so that the prevention services available through HRA could be brought to bear on preventing homelessness. That's why, as I said, I don't mean to repeat myself, but all across the country, evictions are up. They're down here in New York because we've found a way to keep them down, reducing them by more than a third. Similarly, if you look at Los Angeles, tens of thousands of people on the streets. We've found a way to bring people off the streets, and it's based upon what we've been able to do to really change the lives of 2,250 human beings by bringing them off the street and keeping them off the street, that we now know we can go further. Look, you know I'm as impatient as anybody. I was a legal aid lawyer for 33 years. I'm an optimist by nature. To be a legal aid lawyer, I must be an optimist to be the Social Services Commissioner. But I'm also someone who's impatient. And we've made major reforms to make major changes. Thousands of people have benefited. My frustration is there's still some people who haven't yet benefited from our reforms. The announcement this week, I think, will really deepen what we've been trying to do to address street homelessness.
I also think that there are still people who are still cynical about the successes, one of them being the controller of the city of New York. Let's hear what he had to say just recently.
This is a national disgrace. No human being should live like this in New Jersey, and no human being should have to live like that in our city, the greatest, wealthiest city in the world. And this city still has no policy to really have a comprehensive strategy on homelessness. And I have to tell you, as a New Yorker, I was outraged by another silly announcement that they were deploying 18,000 city employees to find the homeless. It's a wreck.
It's sort of a scattershot attack, but before we get to that, I want to talk about one of the things that the controller talked about, which is the SOTA program, the special one-time assistance program that you've had to deal with. You've agreed to stop sending people to Newark, New Jersey, and because they filed suit against you. Now you say you're going to file a suit against Newark to stop them. Why do that when some of the things that they're bringing up point to problems that DOI and others have found in your program?
So I think you and I sat down for an interview just about a year ago. We found that there were situations in which families in the city have been taken advantage of by a group of brokers and landlords. I myself referred this matter to DOI. We work closely with DOI to look at what kind of reforms were needed. We made dramatic changes in the program in terms of how the apartments were reviewed. We closed what was a loophole that individuals took advantage of us in. We relocated a number of families from those apartments. The DOI report was based upon the apartments we had referred. But let's look at the fundamental issue of what's going on with the lawsuit that Newark has brought against us. And
but they just want two things. They want to know where you're putting the people so they can inspect the apartments, which is something the mayor attacked Newark for, saying they're not inspecting the apartments, so they can't inspect them if they don't know where they are. And secondly, they are concerned about the ordinance that they have put in place that you're attacking, because they don't think you should give landlords a year's rent up front, because then there's no way to prevent the landlords from abusing the tenants who are there, because you've already paid them the money.
So let's look at it in simple terms. Suppose you or I wanted to move to Newark. You or I would be able to go to Newark. We could rent an apartment without the government requiring us to say in advance how we're going to pay rent when our lease expires.
Right.
We could rent an apartment without disclosing to the government how you and I are paying our rent. We could rent an apartment without having...
But why do you have to give them a year in advance? Why not give them month by month so that you can check to make sure that the apartments are up to snuff?
Look, we're open to making changes in the program, but what we're not open to is having people who are experiencing homelessness in New York City treated differently than you or I if we want to rent an apartment.
So what changes will you make?
Let's continue, though. You and I could move to Newark now, and we could pay our rent in advance, but our clients are told they can't. Why is that fair? People in the United States have the ability to move.
I think the point here is that by giving them a year up front, there is no hammer to make sure that the landlords are making sure that the apartments are clean. They have no mold. They don't have pipes that break. They have heat. They have hot water.
Look, we think we've put changes in place.
What are the changes?
Let's go through them. So the first key change that we put in place is that we have created an inspection protocol for apartments outside of New York City in Newark that's the same that we use in the city. Requires photographs before.
But your inspectors, under DOI, your inspectors were found to be falsifying the reports.
I don't think that's true if you actually read the DOI report, Marcia. I know you read many things, but I would caution you to read the report. That isn't actually.
Who were found to have filed false reports.
I know you've said that several times, but that's actually not what the report says.
Well, I read it.
What the report says is that there were problems in the inspection process based upon how it was set up initially.
And it also said that some people filed reports that looked like they were legitimate reports, and they never went into the apartment.
When the program was set up, it wasn't set up with that kind of an inspection protocol. But we worked with DOI for almost a year to make changes. We implemented those changes. If you read the report, that's clearly what DOI says, that we worked together to address it. The question about whether or not rent should be paid up front, if all tenants are prohibited from paying rent up front, that's one thing. But if only low-income people who are trying to rent apartments are prohibited, but you and I can, doesn't that disadvantage our tenants our clients in the market?
Don't you want to have some kind of guarantee that the landlord that you're hiring to provide housing for the most vulnerable would have some responsibility to make sure the apartments are kept proper?
Obviously. That's why we changed the way that the apartments are inspected, and we're open to other ways to improve.
Are you open to paying month by month?
We're open to ways to reform the program. We've announced that we're setting up a national hotline.
But what are the specifics?
I'm going through them. You and I know each other a long time. You've got to give me a chance to respond. I can't finish my sentence. So the specifics are the ones that were referred to in the DOI report in terms of the inspection regimens. The specifics are the national hotline that we're setting up next month for families that have moved out of the city. You know, almost more than a third of the participants in the program have moved to apartments in New York City. Overall, it's important to remember the context. More than 5,000 households have participated in this program. Just over 200 have returned to the shelter system. That's a very low rate of return. Newark is very close to here. I think what we have is a number of cases in which we are taking advantage of that are being focused on as an indictment of the entire program. Obviously, it has benefited thousands of people who have been able to move out of shelter either in New York City, in New York State, or across the country. Many cities have programs to give people a helping hand to move out of shelter, including relocating out of their cities. We've given an additional helping hand to people. As I said, the reforms that we have made, together with DOI's recommendations, are to address the apartment inspection process. We've said we would set up a national hotline, and we're open to looking at how the rent is paid during the course of the 12 months. But we don't think it's right that low-income families and individuals from New York City should be treated differently from any other tenant. One basic right that you and I have is to travel anywhere, rent an apartment anywhere we can, anywhere we want to live. And I don't think it's right for a locality to erect a barrier into that fundamental right that you and I have just because the person is paying with rental assistance from us. There's a source of income discrimination law in Newark that prohibits treating people differently based upon how they pay their rent. This local ordinance is doing just that.
So you said that you're open to changing how the rent is paid. Are you also open to telling the localities, and it's not just Newark, it's cities all over New Jersey, and it's places in Westchester as well. Are you open to telling them the places where you're locating SOTA families?
So let me go back to the basics. This is a voluntary program where families or individuals choose to relocate. If you or I choose to relocate to a particular city, do you want the government to know that you've chosen to relocate to that city? Why is that fair for you?
But wait a second,
You to have your information disclosed to the government that you, Marcia Kramer, is moving to Newark and you're going to pay your rent in this amount of money. Why is that okay for you not to have to do that, but one of our clients
one of the
have
mayor's
to?
criticisms at his big press conference on SOTA was to say that the people who in Newark were abrogating their responsibilities because they didn't go and inspect these apartments before they were rented to SOTA families. So the reason they didn't, because they didn't know where they were. So it seems like it's, people are talking out of both sides of their mouth.
With respect, that actually wasn't what the mayor said.
I was there.
That wasn't what the mayor said. What the mayor was focused on was whether or not the housing stock itself is being appropriately maintained and whether there's appropriate code enforcement.
And should these cities be inspecting the housing stock?
Right, but one of the important parts of the ordinance that Newark recently passed was to create a more effective way for code enforcement. We support that. We will certainly participate in compliance with that part of the ordinance. The part of the Newark ordinance that says our clients are treated differently than you and I, that's not something that we can abide by.
Okay, the DOI report, as I read it, said that some DHS employees falsified inspection forms, which is, in a sense, city workers lying on city paperwork. Given that falsifying records is a crime, how many of these people at DHS were disciplined, and if so, in what way?
But again, I want to come back, and that isn't actually what the report said.
That's how I read it.
I hear how you read it, but I read it very carefully. We work very closely with DOI.
Was anybody disciplined in this case?
No one has been disciplined. The workers are being held to the standard that we worked on with DOI going forward. That's the appropriate way to treat the situation. Again, we work very closely with DOI.
But the report basically said that some people never went into the apartments they certified. How, if they're not disciplined, how does that send a message to people who are going to do it that it's okay, it's not okay?
Again, I think you're misreading what the report said. The report talked about what the overall procedures were that didn't require the kind of inspections that we are now requiring. We gave people the ability to move out of New York City if they so chose, or move into apartments in New York City if that's what they wanted to do, as independent people who have income and the ability to pay the rent, or have some other source of income to pay the rent. And then what we found was we got taken advantage of, and then we said we're going to change the program. We're not simply going to allow people to move with promises to fix apartments. We're going to require our staff to do the same kind of inspections for these apartments as we do for regular rental assistance, both in New York City and in Northern Jersey. We made a dramatic change in the program because of the recommendations that we worked on together with DOI.
So how do you prevent these problems in the future?
Well, I think the major piece is that there's a requirement for photographs of the inspections before someone can move in. Different documents are required to avoid what happened a year ago when you and I sat down together with a group of brokers and landlords who took advantage of us by using certain documents that made it appear that they had ownership of the building.
Are you going to take any action against those landlords?
There were actions that were taken locally. DOI concluded that we could not take further action because of the nature of the way the program was initially set up. We've made a change to make landlords and brokers liable for certain representations that they make, and there are penalties that would result from misrepresentations as a result of the changes that we made in the program based upon DOI. Look, I'm the first to say when I look at government programs, you know I run two agencies that I sued for more than 3 decades. And I'm as skeptical as anybody about programs and how they operate. And what we always do when we stand up a program is we evaluate it to see how we can make improvements. Here, there were clearly things that we needed to do better. And we've made those changes. My heart goes out to the families that got caught up in some of the problems that happened about a year ago. As I said, and I think you know this, we relocated those families, referred the matter immediately to DOI so that we could take the kind of action that I think a public official should be taking in these situations. That's why we revamped the inspection process. We're setting up a national hotline. We're going to comply with the Newark ordinance that increases Newark's regimen for code enforcement. We think that's a good thing. We just don't think it's proper to treat low-income families and individuals differently than you and I would be treated, because you and I wouldn't stand for a moment not being able to rent an apartment in Newark if you had to disclose how are you going to pay rent when your lease is over, what's your source of income to pay your rent, and be prohibited from making an upfront payment if everybody else can. So we just want our clients to be treated like everybody else in Newark, and if they're not, we're going to stand up for them in court, and that's what we're doing now.
So last question. When you were a legal aid lawyer, would you have thought that the SOTA program was a good program, or would you have been in court suing?
Well, what's interesting is we have an affidavit from the Legal Aid Society on behalf of a survivor of domestic violence who's in our shelter system now and desperately wants to move to Newark. And so
Is that one of the 34 people who can't move because of the whole suit?
Yes, it's one of the families that can't move because of the suit. It's the holidays. She's a survivor of domestic violence. She has the ability to pay her rent. Because of the local ordinance, she can't move because it doesn't enable her to take advantage of the same housing opportunities that you and I did. So that's why the Legal Aid Society submitted her affidavit as part of our case. But what would I have done as a legal aid lawyer?
What would you have done with the stories that we were talking about a year ago?
I would have done exactly what legal aid did, which is they pointed out problems.
And they filed papers against it.
No, they did not. They gave us information about problems in the program,
right,
and their analysis of problems that they saw, just like DOI's analysis of problems that DOI saw, gave us the ability to make the kind of reforms that we wanted to make. I actually think this is government working at its best. A government agency, a commissioner says, you know what, there are things we could do better here. Let's refer it to DOI and get help. Let's work with Legal Aid and the Coalition for the Homeless and take their input. We made dramatic changes, and now Newark is saying, even with those changes, our clients are not treated like Marcia Kramer and Steve Banks. That's not the way the United States is supposed to operate. Because you're paying with rental assistance monies, you shouldn't be treated differently than if you're paying with private money like you and I are paying. And Newark has an ordinance that prohibits that. The U.S. Constitution prohibits that. So by using certain documents that made it appear that they had ownership of the building.
Are you going to take any action against those landlords?
There were actions that were taken locally. DOI concluded that we could not take further action because of the nature of the way the program was initially set up. We've made a change to make landlords and brokers liable for certain representations that they make, and there are penalties that would result from misrepresentations as a result of the changes that we made in the program based upon DOI. Look, I'm the first to say when I look at government programs, you know I run two agencies that I sued for more than 3 decades. And I'm as skeptical as anybody about programs and how they operate. And what we always do when we stand up a program is we evaluate it to see how we can make improvements. Here, there were clearly things that we needed to do better, and we've made those changes. My heart goes out to the families that got caught up in some of the problems that happened about a year ago. As I said, and I think you know this, we relocated those families, referred the matter immediately to DOI, so that we could take the kind of action that I think a public official should be taking in these situations. That's why we revamped the inspection process. We're setting up a national hotline. We're going to comply with the Newark ordinance that increases Newark's regimen for code enforcement. We think that's a good thing. We just don't think it's proper to treat low-income families and individuals differently than you and I would be treated, because you and I wouldn't stand for a moment not being able to rent an apartment in Newark if you had to disclose how are you going to pay rent when your lease is over, what's your source of income to pay your rent, and be prohibited from making an upfront payment if everybody else can. So we just want our clients to be treated like everybody else in Newark, and if they're not, we're going to stand up for them in court, and that's what we're doing now.
Commissioner Stephen Banks, thanks for being on The Point.